360 Hz. That's a number I did not expect to see on a gaming monitor for quite a while. And yet, here we have it alongside a 1 millisecond claimed response time, G-Sync, and an IPS panel. And Asus have packaged all of that into this, the 24.5-inch PG259QN. This thing, plain and simply, is the fastest gaming monitor that you can buy right now. But is it really worth it over 240 Hz? Can you actually notice a difference? That's something that I'm really interested to find out, because as an esports gamer myself, faster is always better. So what is this thing actually like to game on? And can I even tell the difference between 240 Hz and 360 Hz? Let's take a look. But before we boot up some games, let's go over the design and ergonomics. If you've seen other ROG Swift monitors from Asus, this one will look fairly similar. They've stuck with their aggressive metal and bronze color scheme, a relatively thick chin bezel, and a very beefy stand. It's very gamery overall, but some of you might be into that, and you can at least bet that this thing feels very premium. As always with Asus monitors, the OSD and menu navigation is very intuitive. There's a small joystick along with 4 large buttons on the right side of the display. If you need to make quick adjustments, that can easily be done. The base of the stand is mostly metal, keeping the monitor nice and anchored to your desk, and although the stand has a large footprint, it doesn't actually extend beyond the display itself, and that means that you've got plenty of room for your keyboard and mouse. In terms of adjustment, you've got plenty of height, tilt, swivel, and pivot, and I really like how stiff these adjustments are. That means the display itself has 0 wobble when gaming or typing, so big thumbs up there. Now, if you've been keeping up with the gaming monitor scene lately, then you'll know that IPS panels are getting very quick. Not only are there a ton of high refresh rate IPS monitors out there on the market right now, but the response times are also catching up to TN, in some cases even beating them. And I think that the color accuracy of your gaming monitor is hugely underrated when it comes to competitive titles. A lot of gamers will take a faster panel over anything, but what is that speed worth if the panel can't display a wide gamut of colors and accurately? This is something that I first realized when I tested the 240Hz IPS MAG251RX from MSI. Despite that monitor having worse response times than my 240Hz TN, it somehow felt cleaner and more punchier during fast motion. But of course, the biggest benefit of buying an IPS panel is that you can do other things with it apart from gaming. Browsing content is much better, and you could actually do some content creation and whatnot on this panel right here, despite it being 1080p, which would be the main drawback in that regard. But viewing content is definitely not something that I would do seriously on a TN panel. So overall, I'm really happy that Asus made this IPS and not TN. But let's get to the big selling point of this monitor, which is of course 360 Hz. The big question here is whether you can actually tell the difference over 240, seeing as you will be paying a pretty hefty premium. First of all, there are very few games that can actually take advantage of that 360 Hz refresh rate. A few of them being CSGO, Valorant, and maybe Overwatch, although that's capped at 300 frames per second. Even in CSGO and Valorant, you're typically going to sit around that 250 to 350 FPS mark, even with a very high-end gaming machine in an actual match. So to see if I could actually tell the difference between 240 and 360 Hz, I did a complete blind test in CSGO between those two refresh rates. I had someone else select one or the other, call me into the room, and then it was up to me to decide which refresh rate was enabled. And after 15 attempts, I correctly guessed the refresh rate 10 out of the 15 times, which isn't actually that good when you consider that the odds are 50-50. So I'm going to say that no, I can't confidently say that I can discern between 240 and 360 Hz. The difference is so minimal. And keep in mind that I use a 240 Hz display as my primary gaming monitor, and I'm really tuned to how that feels. And the reason that there is so minimal difference between 240 and 360 Hz compared to something like 144 versus 240 is that when you look at the numbers, the actual speed up between frame refreshes is diminished. With 144 Hz, you're getting a new screen refresh every 6.94 milliseconds, and that gets sped up to every 4.16 milliseconds when you upgrade to 240Hz. It's not much of a speed up, but most well-seasoned gamers will be able to tell the difference. But at 360Hz, the frame-to-frame interval is now only 2.78 milliseconds, and as you can see, that's only a speed up of 1.4 milliseconds over 240Hz. So while I can consistently discern between 144 and 240, I can't confidently decide between 240 and 360. Now I have no doubt that there are some elite gamers out there that have tens of thousands of hours in games like CSGO that would be able to, reliably and consistently tell the difference between 240 and 360Hz, but that is going to be a seriously small group of users. So does that mean that the 360Hz PG259QN is a pointless monitor? Absolutely not, because this monitor does something else really well, and that's super fast response times. To evaluate pixel response times, I used the UFO test from blowbusters.com, and what we're looking at here is any smearing or inverse ghosting on the trailing edge of the UFO. We can see that by enabling the extreme response time setting on the monitor, we do get some inverse ghosting as opposed to normal, which is what the monitor uses out of the box. And the normal mode is looking very clean indeed. It's far from perfect, but for an IPS panel, this is pretty much as good as it gets. Compared to another high refresh rate IPS monitor on the market, the 240Hz MAG251RX from MSI, which I reviewed a few months ago, the PG259QN has a bit more inverse ghosting, but does look slightly crisper overall, with just a little bit less smearing on the trailing edge. Admittedly, it would be very difficult to actually notice this difference in game. Now, when we compare this to my daily driver 240Hz TN panel from Alienware, motion clarity is undoubtedly better on the TN, with the small white spots on the UFO clearly separated. And when we stop to look at these differences, you'd probably be quick to call these IPS panels a smeary mess in comparison to TN, but the reality is, when actually gaming, the boosted vibrancy and contrast of IPS means that motion clarity in game is actually just as good, if not better. This monitor does have an ultra low motion blur setting as well, which can be toggled in the OSD, but this only works at fixed refresh rates at 240Hz and below, so no adaptive refresh rate or 360Hz with ULMB. That I can live with, as ULMB does offer extremely good motion clarity, as you can see here, but the biggest drawback for me is the capped monitor brightness with this setting. I just didn't find it anywhere near bright enough for competitive gaming, especially during the day. So then, gaming at 360Hz. I'd love to sit here and tell you that this is a game changer and the next best thing for competitive gaming, but it's not. The real hero here is that beautiful, vibrant IPS panel paired with some really quick response times. This is what makes the PG259QN so impressive. At this point, I probably don't need to explain who this monitor is for. The specs alone scream that this monitor is focused on giving you as much of a competitive advantage as possible. And for that, it really is for a select group of users, especially when you consider that for the same price of $700 US, you could pretty much get a Samsung Odyssey G7. That's a 27-inch 1440p curved 240Hz display, which is going to give you a much better pixel density and gaming experience for slower paced titles. And then as a much more affordable alternative, I can highly recommend MSI's 240Hz IPS that I mentioned earlier, which can be had for around $250 less, and that will probably be the more suitable choice for most of you. And just coming back to that 360Hz refresh rate, at the end of the day, although I can't consistently tell the difference between this and 240Hz, that doesn't mean that I couldn't potentially game better at 360. After all, you're definitely not going to game worse on a higher refresh rate panel, so 360Hz only serves to add to your competitive gaming experience, even if the difference is slim. So this will likely be the gaming monitor that replaces my 240Hz TN Alienware, and I've got to say I will not be missing those TN colors for sure. And I'm not bothered by the slightly slower pixel response times that result in a bit more smearing. Like I said, the boosted vibrancy of the image actually makes motion clarity look as good, sometimes better. So I will leave some links down below. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.